Okay, one of the most insulting things men have to deal with is otherwise good people, good women, trying to do revisionist history for feminism, which is a hate movement. And the motivation is hateful. Now, this is Colonel Kurtz, and she talks about the feminism, and she's trying to, you know, rewrite history. And the reason why she is because in order to be a feminist, you had to believe in patriarchy theory, which means you have to believe that men were holding women back. So women's non-accomplishments of the past can never be just written up as women's choices. It's always got to be blamed on men, right? And before we get into that, I just want to show you female blacksmiths. Someone showed this to me and said, bring this up. Female blacksmiths in history. And they talked about women taking up blacksmithing for hundreds of years around the world at that. And they mentioned the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages ran from 1100 to 1450 AD, so over 500 years ago. So women at any time could have chosen these fields. They just didn't want to. They wanted to choose a marry husband, make him do all the heavy labor, and then live an easy lifestyle. So that will go from here. We'll see what she has to say.
My grandmother lived in a world of manicures, hair salons, and no place to go in the morning. She shopped and played endless card games, the king and queen of hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds, absorbing all of her intellectual energy. She was caught in a bad marriage with nothing to fill her days. She missed feminism, my mother told me, by only a few years. It would have saved her.
Really, it would have saved her. How? First of all, her life, she's living the life of Riley, and that's a bad marriage. You don't know how many men would love to be in a bad marriage like that. So this shows you that women don't like men and only deal with this once we pay the bribe. But really, what she wanted even more than that. She wanted that man working for her, but her not have to deal with him. And Kurtz, she made the choice of where she put her intellectual energy. She obviously wasn't interested in anything else.
Now, this is one of my favorite books. It's by a writer named Katie Roiphe. It was published in 1993 when she was still a graduate student at.
So this woman in the 1990s has more rights than the men at that era, and she definitely has more privileges. And she's still a feminist. Supposedly, when you get what you want, you lay your sword down. So obviously, feminism isn't about gaining rights. It's a hate movement. It's about attacking men and making excuses for women's bad behavior.
Princeton, so she was very precocious and already very accomplished, even in her mid-20s when she wrote this. And I love this book because it has so many, I think, very interesting ideas about not only what feminism has become, but also it diagnoses some of the underlying problems with the excesses of the Me Too movement, even though
it hasn't become anything. You're insulting us. This is what feminism is and always has been. The White Feather Campaign was first wave feminism. The Scum Manifesto was embraced by second wave. It has always been this. It's always been a hate movement attacking men. You're insulting us, Colonel, by trying to paint into something else. And this woman put it straight. It's the excesses. She didn't say it's not like what I am. It's just more extreme of what I am. Because when you paint men as part of a patriarch that held down women, then you are committing hatred against us, against men.
So this book came long before the Me Too movement. Now, the title of this book is The Morning After: Sex, Fear, and Feminism. And I just want to read to you some of my favorite excerpts, and I think that'll give you an idea of why I think this book is so important, and then I'm going to discuss some of it. All right, so she was talking about her grandmother, right? Now, this was written in the 90s, and so she's talking about a woman that we would associate then with a much older generation, right? And so what she's saying here is that her grandmother, this writer feels her grandmother suffered being constricted in a bad marriage, not having anything to do with her time but play cards. Now, is there something perhaps a little bit classist about that, right?
It's completely classist. She wasn't in a bad marriage. She wasn't constricted or restricted. This is what she chose. It was her husband. That woman's grandfather was the one who was restricted. He's the one who had to fill his gender roles. And I'm glad you mentioned class, because first wave feminists were from the upper crust women. And the second wave came from women once they joined that upper crust. Once the average woman gained the privileges of the earlier generations, that's when they embraced feminism. Women jumped into feminists as soon as they hit a situation where they can toss their men aside. It's betrayal. That's what feminism is. It's betrayal. It's these men, they're chosen for their gender roles, and then they're tossed aside and demonized as soon as those gender roles are necessary. Like the woman feels she can make go of it of her own. You admitted, Kurtz, in one of your earlier videos that you have a boyfriend, and when the power went out, you fell back into your gender roles, which he did the labor. You chose him for that reason. And you would toss him aside if he didn't fulfill those gender roles. So everything about feminism is hateful to men.
I'm sure there are many people, many hardworking people who would love to just be able to sit around and play cards. But the point that she's making is interesting. And this is something that I want to say right at the outset here. I have been accused by some people of hating women and being misogynist, and also, which is clearly not true, and also I've been accused of not recognizing or understanding that there is a long history of women being restricted in various ways, women's rights, being restricted, and women's...
Men have always been restricted. How much freedom did the male peasant of the past have? And now we're still being restricted because, Kurtz, how many house husbands exist? They do exist, but they're so few in number, they may as well not exist. Our gender roles haven't changed one iota, while yours have. You have privileges now. Women have no right whatsoever to talk about restrictions.
Activities and possibilities and everything. And I've never said that that's not the case. Absolutely, that's the case. The human race has a very long history of all kinds of injustices and problems and things that we are trying to work through and get beyond.
That her grandmother living the life of Riley off a man is not an injustice to her. It's an injustice to her grandfather.
What I have said, though, is that what we have seen emerge in modern feminism, I'm not talking about some of these earlier movements or earlier incarnations of the movement or earlier waves, although even those sometimes have their problems like everything does, but...
The earlier movements were every bit as misandric as the modern ones. Like I said, teenage boys were given white feathers by the first wave to ship them off to war to die. And the second wave embraced the scum manifesto, which is attacking men. It has always been this, Kurtz, always.
I recognize that there are all kinds of things that I'm able to do that I wouldn't have been able to do if I had been in my great-grandmother's generation, which is now the generation she's basically talking about here. I look at my grandmother. She's...
I disagree with that. You had I disagree even with her grandmother. She wasn't restricted. See these female blacksmiths? Women have always had these choices. They weren't restricted really at all. What you mean by restriction is they couldn't be a part of the nobility. That's what you meant.
Dead now, but she was a very, very highly intelligent woman, every bit as smart as I think that I am, right? Very, very sharp. And I remember that she didn't get her college degree because back then the accepted thing to do, as a number of you know, right, was to get married and get your MRS degree, and that's basically all you had to worry about. Not that a number of women didn't go to college or finish college or have jobs or careers, but it was definitely very different than now, and that was not something that a lot of women even knew that they could consider.
I disagree. It's not different at all. Today, there are still women who find a male provider. And then when they feel safe because he's paying the bills, then they go to university or college. So you're wrong about that.
So my grandmother, and we're talking about, I guess this would have been in the late 1940s. My grandmother, she got married fairly young, early 20s, had children. And then she asked my grandfather if she could go to school or if she could get her certification in real estate, like her real estate license, basically, because she had an interest in doing something other than being a mom and a housewife. Not that there's anything wrong with any of those things. And
I disagree. There is something wrong with it. A housewife in that era, 1940s, was leeching off a man. All the heavy lifting in housework was drained away by modern conveniences. And so she was just leeching off a man. So I have an issue with that. And you women have an issue with this because, again, the reason why house husbands are almost non-existent is because you wouldn't have a man leech off you like that. You recognize what it is.
I know people always say that. There's nothing wrong with that, but I really mean it. I think that being a mom and a housewife without any career is not only a perfectly acceptable existential calling in life, but
It's not an existential calling in life. It's a privileged position that men do not have the option for.
in many ways could be superior and probably is superior to all kinds of other things that people could be doing, right?
Yeah, it's not working is superior to working. I agree.
Right, so this is not nothing against that, right? But she wanted something more, right? Yeah, there are some people who are more cut out to be housewives and mothers than others, and there are some people who need different kinds of stimulation, all right?
Well, there's probably all kinds of men that would be cut out to be house husbands, but we don't have that option for that privileged lifestyle.
And so she wanted to get her, and maybe she wanted some independence too, because I think my grandfather was cheating on her.
So if her grandfather was faithful, she wouldn't want independence. This is excuse making. This woman has independence because she chose that lifestyle. She didn't have to work for a living. That's as much more independent than any man of the same era that had to work for a living. So this is bullshit.
So she asked him. They were very old fashioned, so she had to run it past him, and he thought about it and he said no. He did not. He wanted to have a totally full-time woman at home.
Well, she chose that. She chose him as a provider, and all he was getting out of it was that the woman be around. He was doing then what men are still doing, paying the bribe. And he knew it. And if this woman wanted to go to college, it was going to be on his dime. And then here's something that men didn't know how to articulate back then. But if she went to college, she would be gaining status with her education. Then she'd have more status than him, and then she would dump him. So it's a counter investment for her grandfather to say, okay, I'm going to work like a dog while you leech off me. Then I'm going to send you to college, and then you're going to dump me once you feel you don't need me anymore. That's a counter investment. Why would he be motivated to do that?
Now, I certainly recognize that those kinds of attitudes were a problem. But what I will say is that we've come a hell of
Yeah, this her grandfather didn't know his place. He was supposed to just work all the time for this woman, and when she felt like dumping him, she would. He was supposed to improve her life, and then she dumps him. That was a problematic attitude for men of the past.
a long way. And one of the things then that this book gets into is the way in which certain more recent movements in feminism, going back even to the early 90s, like the 80s and early 90s when this book was published.
Yeah, you're happy with all your privileges as a modern woman, and these women are rocking the boat because the hate movement never knows when to stop.
Certain of these more recent movements in feminism are not feminist. In fact, they're very problematic from a feminist perspective. So as I
They are completely feminist, and this is what you are insulting men again. You want to be a part of a hate movement and try and put it under a positive light. I won't let you do that.
read the interesting parts of this to you, just keep in mind that that is the setup for this. This woman, Katie Roiphe, when she wrote this, she was a highly educated woman. She was getting her PhD in English at Princeton. No easy feat. She was as she'll talk about here, she was the daughter of a pretty famous feminist writer. And
So this woman who has absolute freedom to choose whatever she wants in the modern era was still a feminist. Why?
So she entered graduate school prepared, I believe, and she discusses this a bit, prepared to go along with the party line about feminism and what feminism meant and what it means to care about women and women's issues and stuff. But she quickly became disillusioned and disenchanted with the political climate and with the attitudes in academia and on campus about certain things, such as Me Too type, what we'd recognize today as Me Too type issues. All right, so I want to actually read this to you with minimal commentary from here.
Yeah, she thought this would be like a women's group where you kind of hang around and shoot the breeze with one another and maybe bitch about the men in your life from time to time. That's what she thought. And it turns out the women were full on hate. And she said, oh, so that's what the disillusionment is.
On. I'm going to add some comments here and there, but I just want you to hear this. And I'm very curious to get your comments and see what you think. It's amazing to me how the questions that she's raising, the ideas that she's raising, the objections, the issues, this is still like very, very relevant stuff, perhaps now more than ever. So this very, very, very prescient. Prescient? I'm always messing that up. But in a lot of ways, it really is. Okay, so here we go. So she was just talking about her grandmother. So when I was very young, I thought of feminism as something like a train that you could catch and ride to someplace better.
Really, what is the better place? Notice there's no discussion of what's better.
My grandmother missed it, but my mother caught it. I knew it was all about having your own work before work meant anything to me but the sound of my mother's typewriter behind closed doors.
Yeah, your mother typewriter, exactly. So it's a white collar calling. We all want to be rock stars and writers, right? We all want a high position, high status job that's clean and easy. You don't have to get your hands dirty. So that's the better place she's talking about.
In the 60s, my mother had written Up the Sandbox, an early feminist novel recounting the elaborate escape fantasies of a bored housewife. Feminism had a lot to do with my mother's own escapes.
It is a fantasy because one of the realities that she wants to escape is to leave her husband and get a job. So the fantasy is, how do I live as a part of the nobility where other people do my labors for me and I don't have to deal with men? That's the fantasy. And the fantasy is actually a reality now. By the way, Kurtz, that's what things like child support is. Child support is the woman gets a man. She only has to deal with him temporarily. She boots him out of the family unit. He pays for her. All his money goes into her so she doesn't have to labor and she never has to deal with him ever again. So that fantasy is a reality now.
I knew that. She would never let my younger sister and me watch the Brady Bunch because it was sexist. All right, so then she talks about
You mean the one with Carol Brady, who lived an easy lifestyle off her working husband? Right.
her upbringing and how her mother raised her with all of these feminist beliefs, in the 60s and the 70s. And then she says, "This is where I come from. I didn't spend much time thinking about feminism. It was something assumed, something deep in my foundations."
Of course you don't. Look, if women had actual issues, you would be thinking about it all the time. She just admitted that you don't have any issues. She never thought about it because she doesn't have any issues as a woman.
When I got to Harvard in the fall of 1986 as an undergrad.
And this is a woman, as you say, from 1986. So by the mid 80s, women had zero issues. And feminism still exists now because its purpose was never about rights. It's always been a hate movement. Just like the KKK never disappeared. Feminism has never disappeared.
Graduate, all of that changed. I found something called feminism that was unfamiliar to me. The feminism around me in classrooms, conversations, and student journals was not the feminism I grew up with.
Yes, it is. It's not unfamiliar. All it is the reality of what it is has hit her in the face. And now she's in denial about reality. And so are you, Kurtz. You are in denial of it.
The Take Back the Night marches and the sexual harassment peer counseling groups were alien and even sometimes at odds with what I thought feminism was. All of a sudden, feminism meant being angry about men looking at you in the street and writing about, quote, the colonialist appropriation of the female discourse, unquote. And yes, that is exactly what academic writing, unfortunately, often is.
Yeah, her idea of feminism was that men of the past held you women back, and you guys would have been climbing mountains if it wasn't for them. This is sarcasm. There's nothing hatred about that, is it? There's nothing hateful about that. This is sarcasm.
It is meant to obfuscate more often than not, whether the writers realize it or not. And I can't tell you how many times I've read obfuscate, meaning clouding the truth instead of providing it. I can't tell you how many times I've read papers over the years, academic papers, whether it's from professors or grad students, in which at the end of it, I felt like I'd actually knew less than before I had begun. But there are all these like pretty, words and sophisticated sounding words. But anyway.
Of course, these women are no different, really, from the woman, the grandmother who's living off her husband. They're in the exact same position. They're not working for a living. They don't have to have any talent. They don't have any skills. They're just playing at doing something. And that's why everything they're writing is a bunch of gibberish. That and the fact that it's propaganda against men. And that's why it never makes sense. Hate movement propaganda is never rooted in reality.
Okay. At Harvard, oh no, this is good. This is really good. At Harvard and later at graduate school in English literature at Princeton, I was surprised at how many things there were not to say that you couldn't say, at the arguments and assertions that could not be made, lines that could not be crossed, taboos that could not be broken. The feminists around me had created their own rigid orthodoxy. You couldn't question the existence of a rape crisis. You couldn't suggest that the fascination with sexual harassment had to do with more than sexual harassment. You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. She's a very well-known feminist writer, I think a black feminist writer. She wrote The Color Purple, which is a good movie. But anyway,
Hey, I saw that movie back in the day. Can I ask you something, Colonel? How were the black men in that movie depicted? They did not come off as victims. They came off as perpetrators to the Black women. They were demonized in that movie. It's only when I think back at my experience watching it that I realized that's what was going on. So trust me, these women who write about their issues, uh, the attack on men it trumps the racism. The sexism trumps the racism. It was the men who were the bad guys, not the white people.
She's making fun of here is that like you can't even in these circles, you couldn't even criticize a Black female writer without someone accusing you of being, sexist or racist. Sound familiar? You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. Cursanta. You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. And the list of couldn'ts went on and on. Listening to feminist conversations in and out of class, I was surprised at how fenced in they were, how little territory there was that could actually be disputed.
Well, it's a hate movement, right? So it's going to be narrow focus. It's like when the anti-Semites go after the Jews, there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room beyond that. You're always going to have to demonize the other. So, I mean, what did she expect?
And this was very much my opinion of my experience when I was in grad school. I got my PhD in English literature, not at Princeton. No, not at Princeton, but at a top 20 program. And so, we were considered, it was considered to be like the elite of the elite, right? Very elite, program for what I was in. And
Really? So why are you a feminist again? Seems to me you're living a very privileged lifestyle.
my experience too was that even though most of the professors were nice, and I would say more often than not, most of them meant well, and I respected most of them as people, but it was so still for most of them so close-minded in the sense of there's still this political orthodoxy that.
Of course, look, I'm sure there were all kinds of Nazis who loved their children. That's what you're saying.
Was just like assumed, right? So she says, I remember sitting through a workshop on date rape freshman year thinking, this is not me. This has nothing to do with me. Now, obviously, she's not saying that it's impossible that she would ever be raped on a date, right? She's saying that the kinds of philosophies and ideas and attitudes that were being promoted in this campus workshop on date rape, she felt were non-feminist and didn't represent her. And we're going to talk more.
Well, she's wrong. It's a hate movement, and it represents the demonization of men represents feminism perfectly. Remember, Colonel, you believe in patriarchy theory. You believe that women were, the restrictions that women had to deal with the past were wrong, that they didn't deserve any restrictions.
More about what those are, but one of them is the idea of the infantilized woman, which she says here. The naive female victim in the film being shown was worlds away from me. Her dress, it was not the kind of dress that I would wear on a date. She was passive and innocent and overly impressed by the boy's intelligence.
By the way, I'm going to break this out, period. This is not about infantilization. This is about using victimhood to attack men.
She didn't drink. She seemed like a goody-goody. It might as well have been a documentary about the mating habits of the fruit fly because it didn't resemble what I had done. The thing that I didn't know then was that the mating rituals of a rape-sensitive community and the attitudes that went along with them would.
It's not a rape-sensitive community. They're not sensitive to rape. They're using rape as a tool to attack men.
Be a part of feminism as I would experience it from then on. A new bedroom politics had entered the university. Fighting date rape and sexual harassment seemed to unite and inspire the feminists around me. Everything was cut and dried. It was feminist against the world, us against them, and increasingly I was feeling like I was them. Now,
who is them? Us against them. It's not the world. It's women against men. And that writer has shown her hand. She is not willing to voice who the opposition is. I mean, come on.
get what she's saying here, right? Like, she is the daughter of a feminist writer and icon. She comes from this family where she was given this, what we would all consider an unusually feminist upbringing. And yet, and she's going to this Ivy League school getting her PhD in Princeton. And yet,
I disagree that it was unusual. Most women jumped on the bandwagon in this 1960s. Once things like no fault divorce came along, well, that was probably in the 70s. Once two men gave the pill to women, that's when the sexual revolution happened. When supposedly free love happened, right?
she's saying, I feel like I'm an alien here. As I see it, now this is a really interesting part. As I see it, there are more than two sides to any issue, and feminists are closer to their backlash than they'd like to think. The image.
She doesn't know what she's talking about. You said this was written in the 1990s? There hasn't been a true blue backlash yet. This is 30 years later.
That emerges from feminist preoccupations with rape and sexual harassment is that of women as victims, offended by a professor's dirty joke, verbally pressured into sex by peers. I would add groomed in, their 20s, right? This was back when she wrote this, the idea that someone, an adult woman, 18 years old or older, could be groomed by a man, even an older man, that was considered, it wasn't even something that people were thinking about because it was so ridiculous.
Yeah, because in that era, the women were still trying to shack up with guys. Now we got to the point where the girls can toss the guy aside. And that's when you girls turn on us. And of course, the pedophile smear is the soup du jour. It's aiming for the crotch. It's a label you put on men and say, get them, put them behind bars or kill them. So that's what this grooming is about. It's not infantilization of women. It's an attack on men. It's calling the average man a pedophile. It's smearing men's reputation as human beings.
I've said this before, and so has Andrea Burkhart, and I'll say this again. Grooming, it used to be a term to refer to strategies that pedophiles would use in order to make children become accustomed to being touched or being approached in sexual or abusive ways. It is morphed, and I don't know who did it or at what point. I'm looking into it.
But it isn't morphed. It's just a tool they use now, right? This is what it has always been. It's just a more extreme example of what's been going on. Like I said over and over again. You like the idea of men of the past holding women back. That is attack on men's reputation as human beings. This is just a more extreme version of that.
But it is morphed from that into this notion that a woman in her early, mid, even late 20s can be groomed by an older man. I just reject that. I just completely reject that thinking and that philosophy and whatever. But anyway.
By the way, this age gap has never disappeared. So young women, time and time again, who could shack up with a guy her own age, chooses to dump him in preference for these older men who've built up status. So you girls are about selecting a man on how much status he has. It has nothing to do with him as a person. So what they're aiming for is to have women shack up with a guy for his status. When she gets everything she wants out of him, she can call him a pedophile and have him thrown behind bars. That's the modus operandi.
And that's one of the problems, in a very Orwellian sense, with what the media and what some of these activists are doing to our language. If you haven't watched it, look at the video.
I think this is a good comparison, Orwellian. 1984 is here. The memory hole is here from 1984, but it's done under feminism. Kurtz, I want you to try something. Go to Google Images and type in women hitting men. You'll find out that all the images come up will be men hitting women. That's the memory hole. That's the rewriting of history. Try finding any article on Google where it puts women in a bad light. You will be lucky to find anything. You know, 1984, the history was always being rewritten. And so here it is now.
I did on George Orwell and Amber Heard. I know that seems like a weird pairing, but one of the things that I get into in that is the way in which some of these modern political movements, such as Me Too and the modern media, mainstream media, have been expanding or changing the usage of terms to a degree that is really just diluting the impact of the language, or it is.
Yeah, the mainstream media behaves the way it does because feminists have infiltrated. And nothing has changed. It's just that it took several generations for them to succeed. And so the media is behaving exactly as a hate movement would behave, using propaganda to attack a specific group, in this case, men.
It's distorting and really dangerously so the meaning and the impact of words.
Dangerously for us.
Okay, let's continue because this is a good passage. This image of a delicate woman bears a striking resemblance to that 1950s ideal my mother and the other women of her generation fought so hard to get away from. Let me read that again. This image of a delicate, I would add, infantilized woman bears a striking resemblance to that 50s ideal my mother and the other women of her generation fought so hard to get away from.
No, they didn't fight. They didn't want to be seen as that, but they were never fighting to get away from that. Women are still getting married to men today and having the men fulfill those old gender roles. No, women just want to hide what they've always wanted from plain view because they find it embarrassing.
They didn't like her passivity, her wide-eyed innocence. They didn't like the fact that she was perpetually offended by sexual innuendo. They didn't like her excessive need for protection. Amen. I have talked on this show before about the idea that you cannot have 100% safety and 100% freedom at the same time.
I disagree because that's what women have now. The Me Too movement Kurtz is not a woman allowed to accuse a man of something falsely, have him punished, and if it's found out that the accusation was false, the woman gets off scot-free. Yes, that's what's going on. So that's absolute freedom and absolute safety. Women are free to attack men and they're safe from consequences. So you're just wrong. Demonstrably so.
Whine about it as some of us might, or complain or be upset. And, I guess it is really tragic, honestly. I shouldn't have said whine, okay? It's a tragic thing. It would be wonderful if we lived in a world where we could have 100% freedom and 100% safety, but we can't.
You do. You girls do.
And so we have to grow up. We have to be adults. We have to acknowledge that.
But this isn't about being a child. This is about being the nobility and us men being peasants. These women aren't aiming for childhood. They're aiming for nobility, where you have rights and privileges that we men lack.
And what she is saying here is that for a long time, what the feminists, like her mother and so many other women that established, that built feminism, whether you agree with it or you don't, and God knows that even the early incarnations of feminism had their issues, but what people look back to as classical feminism, right, and what people look back to as, second wave feminism, a lot of what it was about.
Second wave feminists, you mean the scum manifestos and calling men pigs? That second wave?
Was trying to expand freedom for women.
No, they were expanding privileges for women. And they were taking away men's rights in addition.
And trying to lessen or fight this notion that women were in need of excessive protection, because for so long that was the rationale used for restricting them, right? Is this idea that, well, you're the more delicate creature, you are vulnerable, much more vulnerable to men, to violence, and so forth. And so you need to remain a virgin until marriage. You need to have a chaperone. When you go to college.
No. This has nothing to do with the woman being vulnerable. Virginity was protected because they knew that that was to grab the highest status man you can, the highest status workhorse. They were protecting the woman's investment power, not her vulnerability.
You're going to check in by 11 o'clock every night, or you're going to be in trouble. Hey, some of you who are in college now, this was literally a thing.
It's also man-hating, because it was the idea that some young guy might get his dick wet. So it's mate guarding. It's an insult to young men, too.
My mom had this at her dorm. They didn't want the girls out after a certain time at night.
The thing is, back then, men still had some options. And so if they looked at the body of young girls and said, okay, these men had enough options that they could, if they could find a virginal woman, they would choose her over the non-virginal. And so that's why they were protecting. That's why they were doing it. It wasn't to prevent women, to protect women. It was to keep their status, to pick out a high status man at its peak.
So you could not sleep with your boyfriend or whatever. You had to come in and check in, right? If you were in the dorms, all kinds of.
That's because your boyfriend wasn't a husband. The reason why sex was supposedly kept to marriage is because once the man said "I do," he was the servant. He couldn't get out of it.
Stuff like this that people are not even aware of. And so what happened is the feminists of old, they fought to be able to have free sex, right? To be able to have premarital sex, or to be able to do it.
The thing is, they didn't fight for it until Pincus and Gerasi invented the contraceptive pill. So it was only on the table once they knew they were safe. So again, it's a case of freedom and safety coming together for women.
Without societal censure or whatever. And after the pill, with fewer consequences. Now we can debate.
Thanks for admitting that. So the pill came out, what, 1961? And guess what? Then all the bra burning happened in the 1960s. That's right. So there's never been any risk for these women on the table. Women only break out and do these things when they're risk-free. Like I said, the first wave came from upper-class women who had no risk and made all kinds of demands. The second wave came from the middle-class women who found they had no risk and could make demands.
Whether or not that ended up being healthy for women or whatever, but it's something I believe that women, should have had, the right to, right? To have those same sexual freedoms, but not just sexual freedoms, all kinds.
They always had that right. It's just that they're worried about being pregnant. And in the case you're talking about, the older women was smart enough to say, we know these younger women will want to protect their investments.
kinds of other freedoms, going back to, if you think about 100 or 200 years ago or whatever, the fight to, allow women greater, property rights and things like that. And all this stuff, okay, about the
women wanted greater property rights. They could have had them. Like I said, look, they could have had them. All they had to do was do what men did. But when you live off the back of a man, who would give you property rights if you're not the person making the money and doing the labor?
the expansion of freedom. And here's my point, okay? Listen to me. What I'm trying to say and what she's trying to say here, and what writers like Camille Paglia are trying to say.
Paglia, she's a man-hating trad con. She will be talking along with Jordan Peterson, who's also a man-hating trad con. Don't try and paint Paglia as someone who's in men's corner. She isn't. She's just as vile as any other feminist.
Is that anytime you focus heavily on protection instead of freedom, right, then what's going to happen is you're going to eventually have a reduction in freedoms.
That you're full of shit. Women are free to do whatever they like when they like. Any restrictions they have are self-imposed. What restrictions did you have? None. The woman who's a generation earlier than you, what restriction did she have? None.
In other words, feminism is so focused now on this sort of infantilized perspective of women as vulnerable and victims and needing protection. And
no, they're focusing on using women victimhood to attack men. That's what the focus is.
none of us are saying that women can't be victims, that terrible things don't happen at times. But what we are saying is that this overzealousness at times, these witch hunts, this insistence by certain Me Too feminists and activists that, for example, a woman in her early 20s or a woman...
Come on, Colonel. You only got interested in the Me Too hashtag when Johnny Depp, a man you liked personally, was affected. Before that happened to him, all these other average Joes that you don't give a shit about, you were happy with them getting hashtagged.
And even who's 18 is just cognitively deficient and like a baby when it comes to interacting with an older man. These things are emphasized.
No, they're just saying the older man is a predator and needs to be locked up. That's all they're saying.
Protection, and also at the same time, unfortunately, entailing a view of women that is narrow and is getting narrower, and that will inevitably be a kind of confinement.
Well, it always has been narrow. What did that woman want that you said earlier? She wanted to be, what was it, real estate? That's pretty narrow. She didn't want to become a lumberjack or sail the seven seas, did she? I mean, human nature is fairly narrow. Like I said, we all want to be rock stars and writers.
Engender a kind of confinement, confining repressive policies if taken to their most extreme conclusions. And that's what she's worried about. That's what she's saying. She says, I'm in college and I'm sitting here at this seminar, this workshop on date rape. And they've got the woman in this video who's playing the girl's role, and her attitudes are not modern. She's not sexually...
Yes, they are modern. It's a modern hate movement. Frankly, all it is, again, is this woman enjoys her privileged lifestyle that men only dream of. And she's saying these women are rocking the boat. That's it. Again, but there's no difference really. Because that woman has lived her lifestyle in her era off the back of demonizing men of the past. So I have no respect for her. Now, we'll end it here. I think we've gone far enough. And Kurtz, all I'm saying is, if you don't dump this disgusting, hateful label, this feminist label, I know You are a hate monger yourself. And you're out to attack men. And I have no respect for that. I'm not going to allow you to try and rewrite history for the feminist movement. Thank you.